Mr. President, let me thank you first and foremost for your very inspiring lecture. And thank you for dwelling on the fact that we live in a world in which there's so much, and yet few control most of the much that we have. And those that are at the bottom of the pyramid, which is basically the billions of people that are poor, don't have access to the basic things of life. So whether it's energy, whether it is food, whether it's access to finance, whether it's access to digital technologies and things that continue to divide us. So we live in a world in which it's a bipolar world. It's a highly unequal world. The rich keep getting richer, and the poor keep getting poorer. Now, I wanted to, you raised a very important thing about the issue around agriculture and your views about the kind of world that we should have for agriculture. And you posited about the need to have a radical shift in the agricultural systems, which I agree with. The need to have this shift. And you call them two competing approaches, so which is the industrial agriculture and the agency of the small farmers. And everything that you said about the need to have the views and perspectives of communities and farmers through anthropological approaches, I fully agree with. But let me tell you how I look at the issue of agriculture and the role of smallholder farmers. For so long, people thought that agriculture was only going to be only for smallholder farmers. Don't get me wrong, 80% of our farmers are smallholder farmers. And those smallholder farmers are the same ones that actually feed us with rice, and whether they are from India, whether they are from Philippines, or whether they are from China, or whether they are from Vietnam, you name it. So my view is we can't create a world in which it's a world that we want for smallholder farmers. We have to help smallholder farmers to engage in the world or the reality where they are in. And that world is one in which they need to have access to the same things that advanced countries have. Access to information, access to technology, because, you know, I remember much earlier in my career, I was involved in a debate where some folks were taking me on about what they call low-input sustainable agriculture. And I said, well, I have a big problem with low-input sustainable agriculture, because if one has a simple mathematical function, y is a function of x. If x goes towards 0, y asymptotically goes towards 0. And so anything called a low-input sustainable agriculture, as ideologically exciting as that may be for some people, I didn't like it because it means it will put African agriculture to be low input, low output, unable to feed itself, and Africa becoming simply a place in which people sell food. Now, when we look at the case of smallholder agriculture or smallholder farmers, what makes them different from the farmers of the world? I will posit a number of areas. First, is lack of support. Whether it's in the US, whether it's in Europe, whether it is in, you name it, farmers around the world are provided huge amounts of support. But when it comes to Africa, people say, well, you can't provide subsidy, you can't do this, you can't do that. I mean, why is that? Why is it good for the developed countries? Why is it bad for African farmers? So, in other words, the farmers that are producing cotton today in Burkina Faso are actually more efficient than those that are producing in other developed countries. The only difference is they are not competing against the farmers of those countries. They are competing against the treasuries of those countries because they provide them huge amount of subsidies which African farmers don't have. In other words, I would claim that the African farmers are like somebody you place on a rickety boat and you put on the Atlantic Ocean in the world of global agriculture and you say go survive without support. So my point is we need to have comprehensive support around smallholder farmers. Without it, they can't go anywhere. And those support must be on information, technology, access to market. They must also realize in other developed countries, institutional arrangements are developed to protect farmers, right? people always forget those institutional arrangements when it comes to Africa. And that's where I agree with you, Mr. President, on when you talked about the state, the role of the state. I fully agree with you. When the structural adjustment was done, and the pair of all the things that were supporting farmers and all of that, African farmers were left bare. No access to information, no access to extension, no R&D to support them, no infrastructure to support them. And at the same time, we can romanticize all we want about smallholder farmers. What is most important is that those smallholder farmers must be robustly supported in Africa the same way they are supported in developed countries. And the other thing that I wanted to also say with regard to this particular issue, which you raised in your incredible talk, was the impact of climate change. You know, and I think when we look at it, from Kenya to Zambia to Malawi to many of these countries, they're facing severe amounts of climate change. So I agree with you that the global climate change financing is not doing the job. Africa needs $277 billion a year in terms of climate adaptation. It's only getting $30 billion. So yes, we have to make sure that that is it. But just as in other developed countries, farmers in Africa must have crop insurance. The livestock farmers must have insurance. There must be disaster payments, such as it's done for farmers around the world, for our own farmers. In other words, what's good for the goose, it must also be good for the gander. The third one is what you raised, importantly, about the role of anthropology. And I fully agree with you. They need to understand local context, local knowledge, local institutions, and incorporate all of those things into what we do. Now, I was at the World Food Prize just last week with Dr. Fowler, who won the World Food Prize this year. And he has been working on what he called, that is President Biden's special envoy on food security. And they are working on something called VAX, which has to do with essentially the forgotten crops. So the fonioles of this world, the sorghum of this world, the cocoa yams that I ate when I was growing up and all that. On this, I agree with you that the normalization of global food systems based on a few crops has become a big problem, yes. And so you take, for example, Kenya, Malawi, and so on, all of those countries, Zimbabwe, all those countries used to have sorghum, millet, cocoyam, and so on, but now they were normalized in terms of wages based on maize. So the point I want to draw from your point here is that I agree we need to diversify better the food systems. We need crops that are resilient to climate. We need crops that are more nutritious, indigenous vegetables, and all of that. Now, in my experience, Mr. President, I also find that the issue about local knowledge sometimes is not often well incorporated into R&D. And I'll give you one example. And so when I was chief economist for the West Africa Rice Development Association, which is now called the Global Africa Rice Center, I was living here in Cote d'Ivoire in Bouaké, here, which is the second city here. And I had a student from Wisconsin University who later went on to become Minister of Agriculture for Liberia. And he did his PhD thesis under me. And we were looking at the time about, I'm actually interested in sociologists and anthropologists, just like you, but working with an economist, and we're looking at the role of farmer perceptions and agricultural technologies. And one thing we found was we went to a place called the Bumpy River area in Sierra Leone, and we got germplasm and seed varieties of farmers. And when we got to this particular village, this particular woman farmer told us, she said, this particular rice variety is different because if you cook it, everybody in the village will keep coming back for more. This one, if you cook it, they eat it once, nobody comes back for more. And I asked, why is that? She explained that this one, when you eat it, it fills your stomach, right? So we went back, myself, to the lab, and we did an analysis of this indigenous knowledge that came from this farmer. And we found out that the amylose content of that variety that was filling the stomach was much higher. And that actually influenced the breeding program to develop more varieties that had higher amylose content, things you can put in your stomach and it stays. So I am saying that to say the anthropological perspective, the sociological perspectives are quite important in informing modern science and technology. But I wanted to correct something so that we don't both, probably, maybe we see it differently, but I just want to make sure that we're not at cross purposes here. The issue of the Dakar 2, and I agree all the areas you mentioned. But you see, African agriculture must modernize. African agriculture should not be different from other parts of the world. It must modernize, it must use more technology, it must be more efficient, it must be more competitive, and must be able to feed Africa. Of course, paying attention to biodiversity, paying attention to supporting smallholder farmers, who are the ones that we support. But we have to break the bounded constraints that those farmers have, which have to do with technology, information, markets, infrastructure, and connecting them to value chain. Mr. President, just to close on that, think of the following. When we don't industrialize agriculture in Africa, Africa becomes at the bottom of the value chain. And I've always said that the export of primary commodities, whether it's agricultural commodities, whether it is minerals, oil, gas, and metals, in their raw form, is the door to poverty. And the value addition is the gateway, highway to wealth. So I just want to say here, Mr. President, that I don't see that we are diverging on this particular issue. The Dakar 2 framework is focused largely on smallholder farmers. It's focused on, but however, removing the bounded constraints around them so that they can be more productive, efficient, competitive in feeding Africa. I just wanted to start with those for you. And also when it comes, I'm here in Côte d'Ivoire. Côte d'Ivoire produces the highest amount of cocoa in the world. But yeah, chocolates are made elsewhere, and they don't have a single grain of beans, of coffee beans or cocoa beans. So there is no doubt in my mind that we must be integrated into the global value chains, but we must be able to process and add value and move up on that global value chain. Otherwise, we'll be stuck and become poor. And of course, poverty cannot be a comparative advantage of Africa. Thank you, Mr. President.
I think it's been a very valuable presentation of what is an alternative to my model in a way. But there are many points upon which we are clearly in agreement. For example, on the importance of science and technology. I think that nearly everything I'm saying is about agency. It's about who owns what. I mean, when I began a long time ago looking at these issues in depth, there were a number of people who were owned, if you like, the seeds that were used in Africa. There is now less than a quarter of those because they have amalgamated, they joined together. And then I also am very interested in that's what I mean by agency, is what is being transferred. When I speak every year to young scientists in Ireland, and I urge them to make their original innovations available around the world rather than waiting for an innovation to be purchased by a multinational corporation and put into a black hole with no guarantee as to when it will ever arrive for any service to humanity. I would make a point that is very, very important. It is not a case, I think, in the headlong. First of all, I believe that there has been insufficient interest in African history. Africa's history did not begin at the moment of colonization. There were many movements of both cultural and many movements of an aesthetic kind, many forms of structure, many forms of jurisprudence and so forth that prevailed in interrelationship between clans. And in a way, it is a huge moment in the history of a country when it decides to innovate rather than to imitate. in relation to, yes, I do agree entirely. If you take the model, for example, state aid for agriculture, that is no disagreement with you there. This is the point that Howard Stein has made, is that we need a mixture of models with both state and private. But I would say this, the recent report on the Common Agricultural Policy in Europe has shown that the great benefit of subsidies went to billionaires rather than to small farmers. The concentration in the policy on volume output rather than on the number of farmers has meant that the number of farmers, that is, those who actually touch the soil, those with knowledge of animals, those with information and so forth, they are shrinking. And in Europe, in many ways, what you've had, I suggest, you've had a bad effort at imitating United States-style agriculture on a continent that had an entirely different set of traditions in relation to rural life and agriculture. And we're coming to a point, and it's one I'm being very positive about, where we're going to have to assist directly farmers if we're going to have anybody in a relationship to the soils, in relationship to herd management. And we need all of that because this is a wisdom we need for sustainability, for farmers looking after the land, looking after animals and so forth. So there are many things not to imitate in the European model. And of course, there has been for years many things not to imitate in relation to what had been United States agriculture at an incredibly large scale. And when I do think, I actually I kept thinking when I, back to year 2007, you reminded me of something. In that year, the president of Malawi, President Mutharika, in fact, found himself in conflict with most of the donors who were supplying money to Africa, and indeed with the international agencies. It was at that stage, what did he do? He had said, the point I had in my own lecture, he said we must get beyond humanitarian effort, and he asked for a small proportion of the humanitarian volume to be spent so as to make sure that people wouldn't have to suffer from famine again. He was roundly condemned by the international. In fact, I have to tell you, Professor, that I mentioned Glendenning and Jeffrey Sachs were among those who supported him. And he said, I think at a meeting in 2007, President Mutharika said, they want me to get down on my knees and ask for food. I say I want, in fact, actually to produce food and for what we need and export food and so forth. And what was very interesting was the battle in 2007 as to whether, in fact, by his giving his vouchers for fertilizers and seeds and so forth, it was an ideological opposition, completely ideological opposition. And the World Bank, in fact, and those who worked in it were carrying all of the assumptions that I mentioned. You and I don't differ that much because, in fact, what you are doing is we both want to privilege, if you like, a modern, competent African agriculture. Where I'm pushing the emphasis, however, in many cases, is that this is the way I see it. I put myself back in the family of an African family, in which it's at the first interest, and which largely falls very much on women too, because of the gender adjustments we have to do yet. But you're seeking food. Then after that, there is a question in relation to that, how food is prepared and all of the energy implications of all of that. All of that can, in fact, I've seen it when I visited myself in relation to people using solar energy in relation to it, and African women doing so. All of this is possible. But the issue that we can't simply say, but remember, I say to while I have this audience to say to them, what is moral about one or two individuals controlling so much without accountability? The whole history that we've had is that our models of struggling to accountability, the growing realm of unaccountability, is the greatest single threat to all of us. It's a threat to democracy, when in fact, actually, in many cases, it was a struggle to give public responsibility and accountability in relation to broadcasting. We did it. That is gone. In relation to print, in relation to the flow of money, I simply do not regard any of these exploitative models as a reality that must not be challenged. But I think very, very much of the different places of it. I think, for example, and they know more than when I said it, when I see behind a wire youngsters holding out their empty bowls of food in Gaza and elsewhere, I'm shocked. I'm shocked at all of this. And then when I move to the boardrooms of those who are drawing dividends from their shares in the armaments industry, they should be covered in shame. It is a shame. And there is nothing in terms of the history. I'm at whatever stage I am at my life about it. But the idea that one or two individuals will claim I am the richest person in the world, but I have no sensibility for equality. In fact, I believe you should treat people like commodities, push them around and so forth. I'm against that. Well, what's much more interesting to me in our conversation today, so are most Africans. Africans look at the fun, when I look back at what I studied in before, I look at the people who looked at the dog star Sirius, and they construct a cosmology. In Africa, some of the most wonderful things have been constructed long before colonization. What can I say? When I say this isn't the time to take, here's the choice, with all of these young people available to in fact actually draw on a long, long past before the exploitation and before all of these, but also envisaging the future. I'm perfectly happy, as President of Ireland, I encourage every year young scientists, go to where you are needed. I think, for example, a brilliant Irish Nobel Prize winner who in fact actually offset that I want my work to be available to everyone so that it had an effect on river blindness. That's what we want.
And that's great, President.
We cannot go on forever.
Yes.
The United Nations, I've been describing how it has been made weak. It has been made weak by those who abuse power.
Yeah.
And it just has to be said like that. The United Nations of the future must be one that reflects the vulnerabilities, the possibilities, the imagination, and the wonder of all of the world, without racism and without anything.
Absolutely, Mr. President.
But I do see, I take your point. I'm not a learner.
You are so right, Mr. President.
I agree with entirely one of agency.
If I may just come in.
I criticise the DeSoto model because of what it robbed from people in Central America. It's a failed model.
Yes.
And in my view, it has no place in Africa. I've seen that, by the way, for empirically, it surfaces, I think, in the Lesotho model. I looked at it, where it has absolutely, not only is it not useful there, it's just simply
Mr. President, if I may just come in on this issue, you and I agree on the need to have more supportive state. Because if we say we want to build the globalization from the bottom, that globalization must start by supporting those that are at the bottom. And the example that you gave about Malawi is a very, very instructive one. In fact, for your information, I was actually involved in that work together with Jeffrey Sachs and President of the time, Mutharika. I remember we went to see President Mutharika, and his Minister of Finance was a man called Mr. Gondwe. It's a big man. He used to be acting president of the African Development Bank. I was at that time at the Rockefeller Foundation. And I made the case that smallholder farmers that we talk about, because I don't try to romanticize about things, I'm a practical person. When it comes to the issue of Malawi, Malawi has a very high level of population density. And land being the major issue. Of course, if land is the major constraint, as an economist, I know I have to optimize around land. So which means I have to raise productivity vertically and not expand production horizontally, as you rightly said. So we went over that, and we developed what's called the Malawi Agricultural Input Support Program. And when we presented that to prevent subsidies to farmers, It was amazing. The donors, some of the donors, they just picked their files and walked out of the meeting. And I remember Goldway, God bless his soul, he's passed away now. He kind of moved back on his chair like this, and he said, they are gone now, let's do it. And that was how we provided support for smallholder farmers of Zimbabwe, of Malawi. They produced, Mr. President, in a year, more food than they've ever produced, and they exported 400,000 metric tons of food to Zimbabwe, right? So that tells me that African farmers can be more efficient, technically, economically, but they badly need support. Now, they're not different from any farmer around the world if they get the support. I want to also comment on something that you raised, which has to do with the issue of the global financial architecture. And you're absolutely right, that architecture is not serving the needs of Africa well in many ways. First is if you take a look at it in terms of access to climate finance that you said, Africa is getting about 3% of global climate finance, and it needs a lot more. And secondly is if you take a look at what has happened after COVID-19, and you have all these expenditures by developed countries, and developed countries spend well over almost 19% of their GDP, in $19 trillion or more in stimulus packages. Africa spent $83 billion, about 4.5%. And so that created a divergence post-COVID that we currently have. And if one also takes a look at the conditional financing system that we face, which is the special drawing rights, and you and I were talking about that on the phone call before this thing, the special drawing rights were done, $650 billion were given to special drawing rights. Africa got $33 billion, 4.5% of that. But yet, those that actually don't need that, one that actually got it. It's good that that reallocation has been done to IMF through this Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust and also the Resilience Trust. But here is the good part, Mr. President. It's that the African Development Bank led the work together with the Inter-American Development Bank to say how can the special drawing rights be rechanneled through the multilateral development banks like ourselves. And that model will allow us to leverage by 8 times the special drawing rights. So $1 becomes $8, just like that. And this is the way in which we are going to be able to use the firing power of the multilateral development banks to do that. And I think this is very important to dealing with that. And lastly is the issue of debt. I agree with you, Mr. President, on what you said about debt. There's no way, it doesn't matter whether you like mountain climbing or not, you cannot run up a hill with a pack of sand on your back. And I think the debt situation desires that we deal with that. But in dealing with it, there are multiple ways. There's, of course, the G20 Common Framework, as you said, is very slow. It's worked, but it needs to be faster. There needs to be also debt forgiveness for countries that are badly indebted. There's also the need to have climate-resilient debt clauses so that when there are challenges, as you rightly said, countries don't have to pay. We're working on that. World Bank also and others are working on that. But also need to have catastrophic, we have to be able to insure countries against catastrophic events. And so if we don't insure countries and they have those kind of problems, we are going to have issues. So I do think that we need to work assiduously to make sure that the debt architecture is done, but the only way we can do that is to increase concessional financing available for countries. Because as you rightly said, most of them are going to the capital markets. We need to increase that. And that's why the 2 instruments to do that is the African Development Fund, for which I thank you for your support to that. We are in our 17th replenishment. I would like to ask for yours and others' great support for that. We've set a target of $25 billion that we want to raise. But not only for us, the World Bank, I was with Ajay Banga, and they also are doing their work for IDA 21, so they also require support. But my point is this: we cannot turn around the situation we have in the world today if concessional financing continues to decline at a time when countries cannot access capital markets and they have liquidity challenges and so on. On one particular issue is the issue that has to do with agroecology, which is, you are very passionate about agroecology. Mr. President, I fully agree about the need to have more sustainable agricultural systems, to use indigenous knowledge, but indigenous knowledge is not enough. We have to complement and that with modern science and technology so that our farmers have access to the best of tools that they need to break the productivity barrier that they have. And when they have it, Mr. President, they do wonders. Ethiopia, where your wife worked many, many years ago, you know, we provided them with high-yielding varieties, drought-tolerant varieties of wheat. In 2008, Mr. President, they cultivated 5,000 hectares. Smallholder farmers, all in lowland irrigated areas of Ethiopia. Last year, they cultivated 1.2 million hectares. And Ethiopia became self-sufficient in wheat in 4 years, all done by smallholder farmers. So the point I want to make is African smallholder farmers, when properly supported, they will be more competitive than any other farmer in the world. We just have to end this issue of not supporting them comprehensively. And I think that's what I take away from our conversation today, that we live in a world in which we need to be more equitable. We need to make sure that it's not just a war for the few. We need to make sure that it's not just profit maximization, but also equity in the way in which wealth is distributed. But let's also make sure that global institutions work for those at the bottom, whether it's Africa needing to be at the United Nations Security Council, whether it's African farmers needing support, or Africa needing to also have debt relief so it can actually continue to participate actively in global development. Mr. President, let me thank you very, very much for a very stimulating lecture. Thank you very much for using your wide experiences in agroecology and anthropology to inform our thinking. I think it's a continued conversation. I love you very much because you know, for all of what you do. I also love you because you went to Indiana University. And so when I come to see you in Ireland, maybe you and I can talk about basketball. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you so very much.
And President Higgins, if you could just hold on for a moment. And Dr. Adesina, if you could just also hold on for a moment. This has been a really fascinating and very robust fireside chat where both of you have made very strong statements, taken very strong positions, again, trying to achieve the very same objective. So I want to play the angel's advocate as we bring this session to a close. President Higgins, you've talked about the bottom-up approach, and I was just wondering, which specific examples have you seen in Africa where this has worked in terms of food security and structural transformation? And are there any ways in which Ireland can help support Africa's initiatives in this regard? And I'm going to end with Dr. Adesina and say, as you've listened to some of the concerns and some of the issues that President Higgins has raised, looking at three of your initiatives, the Feed Africa Summit, the Feed Africa Initiative, TAT, which is technologies, or African technologies for Africa's transformation. It's pretty much a mouthful. I'll just stick with TAT for now, as well as special agro-processing zones. These are all designed to drive productivity, but also improve the lives of millions of African farmers. So as we bring this session to a close, how do we bring about convergence in our views, in our perspectives, our models and our approaches to ensure that at the end of the day, development does take place, but development that impacts the lives of the majority of Africans? I'm going to start with Dr. Adesina first, and then, no, actually, let me start with President Higgins first, and then I'll hand over to Dr. Adesina.
I think that we already have had an example of which Dr. Adesina and I agree, and that is very much the 2007 example from Malawi. That posed a direct question. Why is it that, and Ireland, I think, is among the countries that is still per capita the largest in responding to disasters. But why is it globally that people want not to move beyond humanitarian assistance? And that issue was provoked in the 2007 issue in relation to the president of Malawi, who saw that you needed, in fact, to create capacity. There is this, I would say, which is very, very interesting. In relation to what Ireland might contribute as well, I think it is very good that Ireland is supporting the African Development Bank and particularly the development initiatives. And I support that, and I hope it even strengthens. But the concept of cooperation, I've looked at different models, for example, of Ujamaa, Tanzania, and others, which was a state model and the rest of it. If you ask me about looking back at the history of Irish agriculture, I think that we didn't make sufficient use of cooperation. We began in agriculture with very successful use of the cooperative model. But in fact, actually, the imbalance in relation to benefits from the European Union and whatever, it was when we went away from that and moved, in fact, to corporate structures that huge imbalances. The exact same is true in the United Kingdom. That's true everywhere where, in fact, actually people who have, in fact, been taking gains from the common agricultural policy. So there is, in fact, in African cultures in so many diverse ways of using cooperation. And it is possible. That is why if you give agency to such cooperatives, that is curiously, I think, what the president of Malawi had in mind in 2007. It isn't a case of an either or, but I do think as well is that quite separate from issues of Africa and agriculture itself, the international system is in a huge amount, a moment of flux. I think it would be disastrous for literally everybody on the planet if we have totally unnecessary trade wars. It also, in many, many cases, we have to see. But I go back to my word that is unfashionable, and that is the word sufficiency. I actually, when the long history of countries and civilizations, where in fact people made sufficiency their primary aim before you disposed of the surplus, you got civilizations of simplicity, but also of extraordinary value in other ways. I see all of that as in the future of Africa. So I don't think we have to choose, I think, between it isn't a case of, it isn't the case only of you take, I'm not arguing against science at all. It is that science, but science be the agency for it be with Africans rather than be external. The same thing, seeds, implements, and so forth. And I'm totally in agreement with those who are, let's say, in relation to the research in seeds. I'm familiar with what research on rice, for example, achieved in relation to Asia. But you can do the same thing, but also you don't have to exclude indigenous or traditional forms of knowledge in relation to combination and choice of crops.
Thank you very much, President Higgins. The operative words there are sufficiency as well as agency for millions of African farmers. Thank you very much. And last word to President Additioner.
Yeah,
your thoughts.
Mr. President, I think we pretty much are aligned in the sense that if you need a train, it moves on two tracks. And you need science and technology. You also have to make sure that the agency issue of the knowledge of farmers are actually used as part of that, and that we preserve biodiversity, all of that, and focus a lot on those at the bottom, which is for smallholder farmers. Just three things I want to say. If you take, for example, what we're doing in terms of farmers adjusting to drought that you have today, in Kenya, in Zambia, in Malawi, Zimbabwe, like in 2018 or 19, when there was a very severe drought, remember that time, and there were all these problems. What we actually did at African Development Bank was to provide smallholder farmers through what we called TAT, which is the Technologies for African Agricultural Transformation, access to water-efficient maize. These are not GMOs. These are just good science that actually were able to get maize varieties that are resistant and tolerant to drought. We provided that to about 3.8 million households, which probably supported so many, about almost 28 or 30 million farmers, people directly that escaped the drought. If you look at what happened again in the case of rice, which you just mentioned, you know,
Yes.
we have today rice technologies that are allowing farmers to get a good yield, great yield. The Secretary of State Blinken from the United States came here to Abidjan to see the work of Africa rice that we are supporting. And he was blown away by this. We provided those varieties to 3.2 million households that actually helped them. Now, the point that I wanted just to make on this is that we need to close a productivity gap between African farmers and the rest of the farmers in the world. We also have to make sure that we create a resilience buffer for our farmers in the face of climate change, that they are going to be able to cope and be able to produce in the face of climate change. And third is that we need comprehensive support systems of infrastructure around them. You mentioned in your lecture about the whole issue of storage technologies. Today, Mr. President, if you go to African countries, you find the companies that are processing food, they are located in the urban areas, close to the port. Well, where are the farms there? There aren't farms next to the port. All they do is that they bring in semi-finished products, they process that, and they send them inside, disconnected with the farmers, disconnected from providing opportunities for those smallholder farmers. And that's why the African Development Bank is rolling out what we call special agro-industrial processing zones that are actually providing the kind of infrastructure they need. So power, water, roads, irrigation, storage, logistics systems, so that the farmers can be able to get access to to markets. I think this is very, very important. At the end of the day, I believe very strongly that we must modernize African agriculture. We must make it more productive, more efficient, more competitive. Agriculture must move away from being a way of life. Agriculture is a business. Every single smallholder farmer I see out there is a business person that needs information, technology, that needs access to finance, that wants to connect. I come from my father, grandfather were farmers. And I know that poverty is not pretty. And the way to actually do it is to make their source of livelihood a source of wealth. And the way to do that is to make agriculture a business that works for them. And Africa, which has 65% of all the uncultivated arable land left in the world, has a responsibility, a duty, a global obligation to feeding the world, 9.5 billion people in the next 10 years or so. You can only do that by doing all the things that you talked to us today and what I also shared, making sure that Africa gets more financing. We reduce the issue of debt. We ensure there's equitable development. We ensure that our farmers are the center of public policy. We give them comprehensive support. And we make sure that those farmers, agriculture works for them as a source of wealth, not a way of managing poverty. That's all I would say.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adishina. And I'd like to say a very big thank you to you both. President Higgins joining us from Dublin this afternoon. Dr. Adishina here in Abidjan. We're truly grateful to the both of you for your passion, your shared passion, your wisdom, the insights that you've provided, the vision that you share, as well as the future that you perceive if we do get things right. We're indebted to you both, and we want to thank you, President Higgins, for being our keynote speaker today during this 2024 Kofi Annan Eminent Speaker Lecture Series. Thank you so much.